Welcome to Playing Above the Line, where we interview entrepreneurs, business owners, and community activists to get their thoughts and perspectives on leadership. Playing Above the Line is sponsored by Aviso Group, a business consulting and accounting firm focused on preparing clients for the future through innovation and positive growth. Welcome to Playing Above the Line. I'm Alan, your host, and we are back in Brewton, Alabama today at our Aviso office here in Brewton, and our guest today is Jess Nicholas, and I'm excited about this. I've known Jess for a long time. He and I actually went to elementary school together back in the day at Monroe Academy in Monroeville, Alabama, and got reconnected several years ago, and so I'm excited about you being here, Jess, today, so thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So I know that right now, your current position is you're the owner of Centerfire Economic Development or Economics?
Centerfire Economic.
Okay, Economic. And then you're also the executive director of the Escambia County Industrial Development Authority, which is a business development type
Correct. What Centerfire Economic does is provides economic development services by contract to cities and counties primarily. That's what we do. And so the Escambia County IDA is one of those contracts, and I serve as their executive director.
Gotcha. Well, and I've asked this question several times to different people who have kind of come through our podcast that are involved in what you do, because economic development seems like this nebulous kind of esoteric thing that I can never really wrap my arms around. So I'm just curious, what's your background? How did you end up doing what you're doing now? Because I know we were talking off mic that your undergraduate degree is like in music composition or something like that, right?
Through the new college program at Alabama, I was a commercial music composition and arranging major, which new college allows you to sort of design your own degree path if that degree path does not exist already in the curriculum, and mine didn't. They just really didn't have anything that mixed business with any of the arts, and at the time I was doing a lot of writing music and performing it, but you didn't have a music business degree, so I thought, well, let's use the new college program to do that. Mm-hmm. If you're going off without a business plan into the music field, you're already batting with two strikes at that point. But right. The way I got into this was my coming out of college with that career. Of course, the first place I went to work was in journalism. That makes perfect sense.
Makes perfect sense, right?
And spent about 10 years working primarily in the newspaper industry, but also I did radio and television and magazine journalism. In 96, while I was actually still a senior at Alabama, I started writing content for TideFans.com. A gentleman named Brett Young saw something that I'd written on the internet and thought I was a pretty good writer, and said, hey, look, I'm looking for writers for this new venture that I'm doing. Would you be interested in submitting some content every now and then? I said, sure, I'd be happy to help out with that. And 25 years later, I'm still their editor-in-chief. And that's been a really good relationship because I don't really have to worry about the business side of things. He handles that. I just produce content. So it's something that I can do at night and on the weekends, and it still pays a little bit. Makes for a nice little bonus for the family. But the field of journalism is challenged, to say the least, right now. And about 2008/2009 was when I decided at that point I really needed to do something else, because you're not making any money in that. The hours are terrible. Half the people hate you all the time. And half of the other half hate you part of the time. And this is just not rewarding anymore. And I actually left ahead of most of the big layoffs. My last employer in that field was Gannett, and went from them into finance first with Edward Jones. I actually had an Edward Jones office in Wetumpka. And then about 4 years into that, I had the opportunity to come back home and go to work with Coastal Gateway EDA. And home for me, which still is, I still live in Monroeville, but my father's family had such strong connections in Escambia County that Escambia and Conecuh and Monroe all, you're in the same boat I am. We all kind of grew up in that region. It's none of us are big enough to just say, oh, well, I was in Brewton or Atmore all my formative years. So we all knew people from those other cities. And Coastal Gateway gave me a way to help Conecuh and Escambia and Monroe but also Clark and Choctaw at the same time. And I finally felt like, hey, I'm doing something rewarding. I'm actually helping people. It's not as high stress as finance is, where you're helping manage people's individual retirements, and you make a mistake in that, and it's pretty devastating for someone. And so I was happy to get into this career, and then spent 6 years with Coastal Gateway. And then when that assignment ended, then I'm having so much fun with this. Why don't I just do this for myself? And that's what I've done.
Right. But you've got to have a passion, and especially in this area, this part of the country, you've got to have a passion, I know that you do, for the rural, less developed areas, right? And it's something that our part of the country needs, because we're not a Birmingham, we're not a Montgomery, we're not a Mobile, Atlanta. It's a great place to live and raise a family and to start a business or to bring a business, but people have to kind of be shown that, and that's what you guys do.
Yeah, I credit my dad a lot with giving me the heart to do that. He spent 45 years being a small town country doctor and had opportunities. He actually turned down a job offer from Paul Bear Bryant once, which is I can get off on that story and we'll be here the rest of the day. But he always felt like that was his home, and he needed to help the people that were there, and nobody else, well, I would say nobody else, but not enough people were helping in the rural areas. And that's still a concern. And we've continued to lose rural population, especially since the textile industry went belly up in our area. And what led me to actually do it was I was having a phone call with my mom one night, and she was still alive then, and every phone call would inevitably turn into, this person died, this company's out of business, this one caught fire and they're not going to rebuild it. And it was just a steady stream of negative. And I thought to myself about it. I'm like, I can either do something about this, or I can just watch it burn from a distance. And I may not be able to change anything, but if it's going to fail, it's going to fail in spite of my action and not because of my inaction. And fortunately, I have the most fabulous, understanding wife in the world. And I went to her, and she loved where we were living. We were in Prattville at the time. And I said, hey, I got a great idea. I know you love where you're at. I know you've made all these friends. How would you feel if I took us and our newborn and moved us to Monroeville? No more Target, no more malls, no more this, no more large groups of friends, so that I can go to work in a rural area because they need the help, and you may end up living in the middle of some trees. And she said, I'll go wherever you go. And I been very fortunate. If it wasn't for her, I wouldn't be back. Yeah. If she hadn't been as understanding, I wouldn't be back in the area I'm in. And it was a tough transition for her. For about 2 months, she didn't like it. But after she's gotten accustomed to it, she couldn't imagine being anywhere else. Yeah. And that's kind of what we have to sell to people, is that it is a transition to move to a rural area, especially if, we were just coming from Prattville. What's that, 35,000? Yeah. Imagine someone coming out of Atlanta. But after you get accustomed to it, I get to walk out on my back porch every night and count stars. How do you do that in Birmingham, or how do you do that in Chicago? You just don't. Right. And we're not without our challenges, but we're fairly mobile. Everybody has a car. We can be 30 minutes, I can be 30 miles away here doing something. In Atlanta, in 30 minutes, you're still looking at the same buildings you were 30 minutes ago because the traffic hasn't moved. So it does take some adjusting of expectations on the part of these people you recruit. But I think that, again, if I don't want to make it sound like I'm the only person doing this, because I'm not, but there just aren't enough people out there telling the story for rural America.
Well, you guys have had some great success, and I mean, just recently there was an announcement of an $87 million peanut processing plant that's coming to Atmore, 150 jobs, and so it's got to feel, and I kind of alluded to the fact that I think that economic development is kind of pie in the sky thing where you never really know if you're being successful. But I've got to think that whenever something like that happens, you finally see, okay, yeah, what I'm doing is making a difference.
Yeah, it's the easiest budget line item for people to cut. A lot of people don't understand it, and that I don't hold it against them because it's one of those things that it doesn't not have a guaranteed payoff. We went through a issue about 30 years ago where towns were building spec buildings and thinking, well, we just built this building. We're soon to get a company for sure. And a lot of them stayed vacant for 20, 25 years. And so when you've had that experience once, it's not easy to go back into a city council meeting and say, hey, I need you to spend $20,000 on this idea and $10,000 on that idea, because inevitably there's going to be somebody there in the room that says, I'm tired of throwing money at things that I can't see. They can see a paved road.
Right.
They can see a traffic light, but they can't see that this money that you spent 4 years ago is going to turn into something next. Back when I was with a regional organization, my statement of what makes for successful economic development was spending money you don't have in a district you don't represent for a project you may never land. And until you can get comfortable doing that, then you're really not doing economic development. It's not a gamble, but it is certainly always a long-range play.
Yeah.
There aren't many short-term projects in our business. Even the ones that hit quickly take multiple years.
Yeah.
Peanut plants, one of those. Coastal growers, I've been working on that for 14, 15 months now. And I need to thank about 300 people that helped work that project, especially United Bank Community Development, I think was probably and the city of Atmore, and then South Alabama Regional Planning Commission, the state of Alabama. Everybody had a hand in that. We had 221 people, I think, was what we counted at the groundbreaking. And when I looked out, everybody there was either an owner or somebody that had something to do with the project.
Yeah.
When it takes that many people to pull it together, that's the biggest challenge of this job, in addition to getting the people to see the value of it, is the complexity of what it takes to actually do it well.
I think your perspective is unique in that just in your role now, you deal with all kinds of people at every level of city, county, state, sometimes national government. You deal with business owners and representatives and CEOs and CFOs and blue-collar workers, and then and that's just in your role now. You came across all kinds of folks, I know, when you were a journalist. So I guess what I'm saying is I think you have a unique perspective on how to interact and sometimes how to influence people. So in your view, what's the most important thing about trying to not necessarily lead somebody, but communicating with people and trying to get them to pull in the direction that you want them to go and get them to come alongside you and doing whatever it is that you're trying to get done?
If you split this up, on our side of the table and then the company side of the table, in our side, meaning the public, if you're on that side, it can be a challenge with certain elected officials because they go in with either their own set of goals and targets that's what caused them to run. And economic development is not usually what causes them to run. It's they're running because they want to solve a certain problem, right, especially at the local level. This changes when you start talking about Congress or the presidency, obviously. But when you're at the county commissioner level or the city council level, 99% of those guys are there because they saw something they didn't like in town and like, hey, somebody needs to fix that. I'm going to fix that. Very seldom is that reason general economic development. Mm-hmm. So your challenge there is they're all looking at a bottom line. They're not the federal government and they can't run a deficit. So they have a certain amount of money, and you've got to convince them that, hey, you've got to take a risk. You've got to take a leap. You have to do things that may go counter to some of the things you promised to do or not to do when you ran, because now you're in here and you can see that it may not have be as simple as it looked from outside. Now you're inside. So come work with me on this, because I think if you'll put a little bit of money in it or if you'll put a little bit of effort into it, I think we can win. And for the most part, I'll say this, is that the vast majority of the ones that I deal with, at the local level, you're dealing with business owners. You're dealing with farmers. You're dealing with the guy that works for the railroad. And they also happen to be an elected official. They're very plugged into their communities. They're very down-to-earth people. A lot of them don't have political aspirations above that level, so they're not trying to trade on influence to get further up the chain. They're there to do what they said they were there to do. Mm-hmm. And they're going to work with you. That's easier a lot of times than it might seem. Listen to their concerns. You try to find a way to help their concern and just get the opportunity to communicate your concern. Now, if you're talking about the companies, that's a big challenge because we find out over and over that there are things that they just don't know, or they make assumptions about rural America that aren't true. Mm-hmm. We were dealing with one project in particular where we were trying to recruit them here to Escambia County, and their data provider could not provide them accurate data from Porch because it was a federally recognized tribal reservation, and they did not have any demographic. When I say any, they were telling us that the population of Porch was 0, and we were just kind of chuckling at that because, you know, if you think it's 0, fly down here. We'll show you it's not 0, you know. Yeah. And so that's part of the problem. And then the one thing that you do have to overcome as an objection that is legitimate is the workforce issue. Do you have enough people to work at my company? And that's an issue that's, especially before COVID, and the country was at full employment at the time, 3 and 4% unemployment, you know, or sometimes 2.5 or 2. Those types of questions were legitimate no matter where they were being asked.
Right.
Middle of Escambia County or the middle of Detroit, where are you going to find me people to work? Everybody already has a job. And so then you have to be creative, but you have to be honest. You can't just make it up out of whole cloth and say, oh, there's not going to be a problem at all. Come on down and, you know, we'll have you 100 people lined up at your doorstep on the day one. We probably won't. So how are we going to find those people, and how are we going to answer objections that may come from bad data or from bad assumptions, like about our school systems, or we get more of, you know, I heard, you know, there are snakes crawling out of everybody's house every day. Y'all live in the middle of the trees, and you know, just silly things like that you have to, well, it's not quite every day. You know, every Tuesday the snakes come out of the house, you know.
Right.
Wednesday it's the possums, you know, and you try to make them kind of see the absurdity of their preconception sometimes.
Yeah, no doubt. Noble cause indeed. I know that, you know, you do face a unique set of challenges, which I appreciate the effort that you put in, and I'm glad that we've seen some very positive results from what you guys are doing. I want to switch gears just a minute because I think that you're unique, and I've asked this question again a couple of times, but nobody really has ever, I don't think, been as plugged into the machine that is Alabama football as you have over the past 25 years. So, and I'm just interested because Alabama is very successful. They've won, I don't know how, you know, a lot. But you've seen it before the Nick Saban era. You've seen it during the Nick Saban era. So what is it about what he does? And I'm thinking of it from a process standpoint, a leadership standpoint. I mean, what has allowed him to be so successful when I would say that people that have come before him maybe had as much talent to work with, but they obviously did not have the results or did not get the results. What is it about him, do you think, has been so different?
He could be the CEO of any company he wanted to be the CEO of. You know, he could be the CEO of Apple if he wanted to. He might not know anything about, you know, the guy famously doesn't email or anything. I mean, he didn't even use Twitter up until about 5 years ago when one of his assistants finally, I think, said, look, you got to do it. This is how the recruits are.
Yeah.
He seriously has the organizational skills of the best CEOs that ever lived. He could be whatever he wanted to be. The second is process over results really works. It kind of sounds non-intuitive, but it actually, if you focus on those things, if you focus on doing the things necessary to be successful, success will usually follow. And the other is he's not scared to change. He does not get stuck in a specific way of doing things, and by Jove, that's going to be the way we do it now and in 25 years. And, you know, I would argue that I'm making the Alabama fans' argument, but I would like to hear the counter to this, too. And the argument is that the number 1 and number 2 head coaches in the history of college football were both Alabama coaches, Bear Bryant and Nick Saban. And they both shared that passion for innovation. Bryant won national championships with at least 2 very unique offensive styles. He changed his offense from a pro-style attack to the wishbone. He did not get locked into any one way of doing anything. And Saban's the same way. And part of their programs will never change. The commitment to detail is not going to change. That's not one of those things that will evolve over different systems. But he's not going to get locked into, say, being the air raid offense guy, and that's what it's always going to be. You see some of these guys, and when the run and shoot came along, you remember when we were growing up, Houston was putting up 60 and 70 points on everybody, and all the fans are thinking, well, this is football now. Andre Ware, the quarterback, this is how football is always going to be. And then the way football always progresses, the offense makes an innovation, then the defense figures out how to stop it, and then it's on you to make the next offensive innovation. And there was no second act for, was it John Jenkins was the head coach down there at the time. When people changed to fit his offense, he couldn't figure out how to take the next step. And Nick Saban has been like, I'm just going to hire somebody else who's smarter about that than I am. Right. And I'm going to let them do what they do. And that's the same thing Bryant did. Yeah. Bryant and Saban were very similar in that respect. I think if they were both alive right now, they'd have a heck of a lot to talk about over coffee. But that's where I think, and just that laser focus on the details of the process. And then you've heard him say this, I hate to lose more than I love to win. And when you're that determined that you're going to get the details right and that you're not going to accept failure, he's probably not the nicest guy to work for in the world. He goes through a lot of assistance. Yeah. But
well, and you made a good point. He doesn't seem to be worried about being threatened by bringing somebody in that may be better at something than he is. I mean, he's still the boss, obviously, but he's not worried about some kind of, coup or something taking place. Right.
It's a very good object lesson in letting your own ego take over the direction of the company.
Yeah. And I would think that, if anybody had a right to have the ego, it's it's him. Let's switch gears again. I want to go back to your dad. He was my doctor when I was growing up. Loved him. Great guy. I know you learned a lot from him. Can you kind of point to maybe what you learned from him specifically, and maybe another influence or mentor or two in your life that you may have learned life lessons from?
Well, my dad, just to kind of let your listeners know how unique he was, he retired in 2002, and he was making house calls up till 2002. He was the guy in town that if you really didn't have enough money to go to the doctor, you could go see him. He always put service ahead of his bottom line. The motto that he ran his practice off of for those 45 years, and was one of the reasons why he very famously never lost a patient on his operating room table over those 45 years, was if you listen long enough to the patient, they'll tell you what's wrong with them. And that also explained why he hated medical insurance companies, because they would want him to see somebody every 20 minutes, and he was like, I'll be done when I'm done. And you were a patient, you've waited in his waiting room past closing before. I'm sure it was the most common complaint. But if he was prioritizing complaints, he was making somebody wait was going to be well down the list behind, I want to know everything about that patient, and eventually they're going to solve the riddle for me. I won't have to. And that's what he's probably, other than his bedside manner, everybody loves him for that. He had no enemies in his life. Other than that, his ability to be a diagnostician was very well known, not just in our region either. There's a story about him basically sending a patient to Tulane Hospital in New Orleans. That's the only place that knew how to deal with the problem, and they didn't want to take the patient because they didn't want the referral to come out of a little small-town country doctor in Monroeville. But Dad's diagnosis of the patient's complaints were accurate. And so when the patient finally got to Tulane looked at it and said, he was right, and you do need to be here, and we need to do surgery now. And it saved the patient's life. He was just generally the best man I ever knew. So watching him treat people well and always doing I never knew my dad to take the morally bad path. If there was a choice to be made, he was always going to make the right choice for the right reasons, even if it may cost him money, may cost him time, but that's what he was going to do. And so that's how I try to honor him. And now I'm trying to think of who else I want to, because there's been a lot of people that has been a lot of people that have mentored me. And gosh, that's a good question, because I don't want to say one and then I'll think of another one in the car on the way home.
Right.
Yeah, I've been very fortunate to have some good bosses. I'll say this: John Johnson, who was the first. He was the person that hired me into economic development. And when he took a chance on me because I didn't have a lot of experience in the industry. John was a community college president for 25 years and was probably the best critical thinker that I ever knew. And that it's hard to be a good one, because sometimes you'll get tied up in your emotions and let your emotions drive your thinking. And John had a talent for always being able to see things from about 3 or 4 different angles, and always being able to plan the attack and account for, if this goes wrong, what do we do? Okay, if this goes right, what do we do? If this goes wrong and then later goes right, how do we adjust? And he was always able to put together the right people in the right places to move a project forward. Now, at the same time, John will tell you that he had enemies sometimes, because he was also one of the hardest pushers I've ever known.
Yeah.
But sometimes you need that. You need somebody, especially in the rural areas, where the sort of the default setting is, well, that's the way we've always done it, or it's, we're 20 years from the last good thing that happened to us. What makes you think that this is going to be any different? Somebody sometimes has to get out and push from behind. John called it, it's hard to push a rope, was one of his sayings. And it is. It's hard to push when people don't exactly want to line up in a straight line. But he was able to do that. He was very successful. And I don't know that there's been a more successful president at Alabama Southern, where he was, / Patrick Henry. That's what it was when he took over. But as an economic developer and just as a critical thinker, he was something to watch. There were plenty of times since he retired that I've caught myself sitting there thinking, okay, this is what I want to do, but would John agree with it? And if he doesn't agree with it, why would he not agree with it? Yeah. And you sort of learn how to critically evaluate yourself. And then sometimes I'll still pick up the phone and call him and go, look, I'm stuck. I'm stuck between two choices, and here's what I'm thinking about doing. And the more that's happened over the years, the more that I realize that he's saying, yeah, I kind of agree with your choice, not, I think you should take the other road. So I'm getting more and more like him, and I consider that a good thing. I don't push as hard as he did, because I'm just not that confrontational, but he gave me a gift in being able to critically think through tough problems, and it's something that should be taught, and I think more in our schools actually, as to how to actually do that.
Yeah, agreed. And we had Will Ruzick on 2 or 3 weeks ago, I guess maybe, and he mentioned Dr. Johnson as well. So obviously he has had a great impact on not only you, but on others. Yeah. Great guy too. I know him personally as well. He's a great guy. All right, we got to start wrapping up, but I do want to, so we've talked a little bit about the business side of your life, but I know you've got all kind of hobbies. My gosh, I was telling Carrie earlier, I think you're the epitome of a Renaissance man. You're cars and journalist and writer and music and all the things. So of all of your hobbies and things that you like to do, what's your favorite? What do you like to spend your time doing when you're not economic developing?
Man, that's tough. Anything that involves my family. I've got a son that I never thought I was cut out for fatherhood until I had him. And 5 seconds after he was born, I'm like, why didn't we do this a lot sooner? And I think my wife's in the same position. We were always, you're always worried about whether you're going to be a good parent or not. And then you have to actually do it, and you find out that you're better at it than you thought you were. But as far as any of the other hobbies, goodness. Probably, this is going to sound strange, but I've been bowling now since I was 8, doing it in leagues. Met a lot of good people through that. Probably 3 or 4 of the folks that were in our wedding, my wife's and I's wedding, were people that we had bowled with before. It's kind of a strange thing to say that sport's not as popular as it used to be, unfortunately.
We talked about bowling. Yeah, because you
said
that.
I actually got my own drill press at the house and drill my own equipment. I made my own golf clubs too when I still played golf. It's just a hobbyist thing. So actually, I bowled a USBC Nationals one year. That's probably the pinnacle of, and that was 10 years ago, and I'll never get back to that. Right now, I'm just trying to hold on long enough to.
This dude does. I don't know.
I just do weird stuff. I don't do interesting things. I do weird stuff.
But it's interesting to me. I mean, for sure.
Old 1980s cars.
Yeah.
A lot of stuff on the computer. Still play video games with friends on the computer. And travel. And that goes back to my wife's name is Melina. My wife Melina, my son Creighton. And we've all liked to just throw in the car and just go. You know, we don't even sometimes pick a destination. Just what do you want to do this weekend? We're getting in the car, pick a point on the map and drive to it. We've done that before.
Very cool. Are you a reader? Do you read a lot?
Well, what I typically read a lot of is if I have an interest in something like, let's go back to the bowling thing, for instance. You know, there's a lot of periodicals on that. There's also a lot of how-to. You don't just pick out a drill press one day and say, I'm going to start drilling bowling balls. So a gentleman who was recently deceased from COVID, actually, named Mo Pennell. Mo was... You'd watch his podcast or watch the videos he put up on YouTube, and the guy was pretty much a physicist and a chemist who just, his passion was bowling balls too. So, I mean, he can actually explain the science behind, here's what makes a bowling ball do what it does. Here's why when you watch on TV and these guys are doing these things, why you can't go out and replicate that in your local bowling alley with a rental house ball.
Yeah.
And so for anything that I would have an interest in, I would absorb everything that I could read about that, whether it was travel, bowling, golf, you name it. In general, a couple of authors that I've really, back when I was in the journalism field, particularly Louis Grizzard, I've always been a huge C.S. Lewis fan. It's really hard to write in second person, and he does it, or can do it. And that's like a cardinal sin of writing. You're breaking it by addressing your readers in a fiction work in the second person, and he manages to pull that off. But one of my favorite books ever, and I need to reread it for about the 20th time, is Rally Round the Flag Boys by Max Schulman. That is one of the funniest books I've ever read. It's in my parents' library, and I made sure to keep it after they were both gone. It's basically written about kind of the post-war nuclear hysteria, but it's a total comedy work. They actually made a movie out of it that wasn't very good back in the 60s, so...
Okay, well, that's a new one. I'll have to read that one. I have not heard that one mentioned before. All good stuff. So before I let you go, and I like this question. I asked it some. I kind of got away from it, but I asked it, matter of fact, to Rick Wilson, who you know, last week. As you've done a lot. If you can go back and tell 18-year-old Jess Nicholas one thing when you were graduating from Monroe Academy back in 1991, what would that be? What piece of advice would you give your 18-year-old self?
That's a good question because it's got two very distinct answers to it. And I can't pick between the two. One is I would not take the opportunity. And the reason for that is because if you tell yourself to change your future path, you're not going to meet people that you met along the way and do some things that you did along the way. You look back at high school and you think, man, I would have really liked to ask this girl out, or I really would have wanted to take this trip and I didn't take it, or I wanted to do this, but I didn't. But what path does that set you on if you change the flow? It doesn't matter so much up until the point where you have your own family. So now anything that you tell your past self could endanger the actual existence of your children. So I wouldn't probably at this point, if you'd asked me that question 10 years ago, I would have gone back and said, don't get locked into journalism like you did. It just didn't have the future that you thought it was going to. And at that time I was working in finance and starting to think about economic development. So I would have probably said, take that career path sooner. But if you're asking me today to answer the question, I skip it. I watch myself walk around for a few minutes. I get to see mom and dad alive again, maybe from afar, but I don't take the opportunity to go in and mess that up because I wouldn't do anything in the world to mess up my family that I have now.
Nothing wrong with that. Jess, thanks a lot. This has been
Yes,
great.
Sir.
Appreciate you joining me.
Thanks for having me.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. And if you did, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe on iTunes and Spotify. It definitely helps us in the ratings, and it also makes it easier for other folks to find the podcast. And as always, a big thank you to producer and editor Carrie Wolf. Playing Above the Line is sponsored by Aviso Group. If you want to know more about who we are and what we do, you can visit our website at avisogroup.com. That's AVIZO group.com. You can also check us out on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Thanks for listening.